Well, thanks everyone for coming so late. We're saving the best for the last. My name is Karthik Vishwanath. I'm part of the AWS config team. I run the engineering team. I just want to introduce yourself.
My name is my name is Ajish Abraham. I'm also part of the AWS config service team. Glad to be here to talk to you all today.
Awesome. Cool. Okay. Yeah, if you want to turn off your mic. Okay. So, in case you did not see it, so we launched compliance score for conformance packs. So, but before we actually go into the details of the launch, I'm probably going to spend some time talking about config, just as a refresher of what is config and how you can actually use config. And then Ajish will go into details about the actual launch that was announced yesterday. Right. So, with that, let's take a look at config. So with config, there's two value propositions with config. The first is configuration management or change management, where we track the configuration changes to your AWS resources, right, as well as non-AWS resources. So you can use config for that. And the second use case for config is compliance management, where you can use config to implement compliance in your accounts. So we'll dive into details for these two services. The other value proposition with config is also, which we will not talk about today, but with config, you can also get uh, visualization where you can actually look at the configuration changes as well as the compliance changes across multiple accounts and multiple regions using a single pane of glass, as well as how you can write some SQL queries. So it's aggregator and advanced query. We won't talk about that today, but we'll focus more on giving the talk about config. We'll talk about the use cases for recording as well as compliance management. So let's get started. So config is the core for compliance evaluations, right? So we'll talk about why that is the case. So the first feature for config is config recording. Right? The purpose of config recording is it gives you the ability to track configuration changes to your AWS resources. So anytime you create or update an AWS resource, we create what's called as a configuration item or a CI, right? And we record these CIs and we send it to your S3 bucket. Right? Another unique value feature that we have with config recording is you can see a historical timeline for these resources, right? How these resources have changed over time. Right? So that's another good way for you to see track changes that's happening for your resources. Today with config recording, we've onboarded 52 different AWS services across 145 resource types, and we're constantly adding support for more resource types every month. So that's something that you'll periodically be seeing us launching more support for resource types with config. With config, you can also onboard non-AWS resources. So if you have your resources using on your on-premise or on other cloud providers, using this feature called custom CIs, you can actually onboard other resource types also with config. So config recording is foundational for compliance management. The reason, just to summarize, config recording is the service that you're actually using to track your resources. And why that is critical is once your resource changes and once you have that information about that resource, you can actually build on top of that using config rules. So what is config rules? Config rules is the service using which you can actually define policies in your organization. An example for a policy would be, I want all my data to be encrypted. Right? So that's the policy that you would define. So now that policy can map to multiple config rules. So you could have a config rule for your S3 resources where you're checking to see if every S3 resource is encrypted or not. Similarly, for an EBS volume, you can have a config rule that checks for every EBS volume that's encrypted or not. So config rules is the feature by which you can actually implement policies that you want to enforce in your organization or in your AWS account. So let's just do a walkthrough of what the experience is going to look like. So let's say you have um, uh, an EBS volume that you have created. right? So when you create this EBS volume, when if you have config recording turned on, we're now going to record a new resource, EBS volume that was created, and we generate a CI for this new resource, right? The EBS volume resource. And then config recording passes this information to config rules. So now you've deployed a config rule, which is going to check to see if the EBS volume that is created has encryption by default enabled or not. Now, if that resource has encryption enabled, then we mark that resource as compliant. Life is good. Now, if that resource EBS volume does not have encryption enabled, now that resource is going to be marked as non-compliant. Right? When a resource is marked non-compliant, you can also define runbooks, which will take remedial actions for non-compliant resources. So you define these runbooks. So there's out-of-the-box runbooks that AWS offers, but you can define your own runbooks as well if you'd like. Right? So that will allow you to take remedial action when you have a non-compliant resource. So that's config recording and config rules. So there are two types of config rules when it comes to how you author config rules. So today with AWS, we offer out of the box more than 250 plus config rules, which is called as managed rules. So this is authored by AWS, and you can just take these rules and deploy them as is. But we also recognize that we're not going to be able to author config rules that meet every single policy that you'd want to implement in your organization. So we give you the ability to actually define your own custom rules, right? So today you can use a Lambda, a Python-based rules, and use the Lambda function. We recently also launched BSL support, so you can use CloudFormation Guard to author config rules. So with the advantage with CloudFormation Guard is it significantly simplifies the authoring experience. You can actually use policy as code. We had another session where we actually gave you an example of if you compare a Python-based rule versus DSL, a Python-based rule where you'd probably have like 100 lines of code, with DSL it's just 3 lines of code. The fundamental difference with a DSL-based config rule is you do not have to deal with any of the error handling, permissions. Everything is handled by config, right? You just give us the actual text, right? So it's actually pretty cool. So that's in terms of how the rules are authored. In terms of when the rules are executed, again, there are two types of config rules. For the example that I talked about with the EBS volume getting created and then you're automatically running a rule evaluation, that's called a change-triggered config rule. Right? So this is when the resource is created, we record it, and we're immediately going to process the rule evaluation for that resource. That's change-triggered. The typical use case is when you're looking for continuous compliance, where you want to continuously track your resources, ensuring that they're compliant against the policies that you've defined. Use the change-triggered. The second type of config rule is periodic. So the same example, let's say you created the EBS volume, 3 months passed by, you did not touch that particular resource. Now, if your auditor walks in and says, hey, show me your resources, whether they're compliant or not. So the data that you're going to show is an evaluation that was run 3 months back, right? So your auditor may or may not accept that. So if your auditor has a requirement saying, okay, you should have policies executed in the last 30 days, obviously that's not going to work for you. That's where you can use the periodic rules. So with periodic rules, you specify the time at what frequency you want to evaluate these rules. And so they run at that particular frequency. So that's config rules and recording. So built on top of config rules is a variety of other AWS services. You have Security Hub, Backup. So if you look at Security Hub controls, that's the same as a config rule under the covers. They're using config rules. Similarly for Backup, Audit Manager, the ensuring that you have the right backup policies, they use config rules. With Control Tower, guardrails, detective guardrails, they use config rules are used. So we'll talk in the next set about conformance packs. Let's go right in. So with config rules, if you have, let's say, 100 config rules in your organization, right, and you want to deploy these 100 config rules across many accounts, right, every single time you have to ensure it's the exact same 100 rules that is deployed across accounts. So now you are exposing yourself to human error where you could commit a mistake when you're trying to deploy those that many rules across multiple accounts. So that's where conformance pack comes in handy. It's basically a template where you do the exercise of what are the 100 rules I want, what are the input parameters. You create it once, right? And from that point on, you can use that template called conformance pack. It's an honorable resource, and you just keep deploying the conformance pack, right, which encapsulates all these 100 rules that you created. So so that's the first value proposition with the conformance pack, where it simplifies the deployment experience. The second value proposition for the conformance pack is how you can enforce compliance across your AWS organization. So if you want to deploy these rules across all your member accounts, when you deploy a conformance pack, what it ensures is the rules that are deployed in your member accounts are immutable. So meaning now all your member accounts will have those 100 rules deployed, and they cannot delete them or change the input parameters for the rules. So it's a way for you to enforce that these member accounts are adhering to these policies. Um, the other use case with conformance packs is also um, this notion of process check rules. So this is a special type of rule that is specific only to a conformance pack, right? So the idea is, if you look at conformance packs today, there's really two use cases for conformance packs. One is operation best practices, and the second is continuous compliance. So today we have more than 775 conformance packs out there. These are templates that we've published. A whole bunch of them are operation best practices like S3, networking, security, and we also have compliance conformance packs like for HIPAA, PCIS. So where you can use it as a starting point, right? And if you say, hey, here is AWS's recommended config rules for HIPAA, and if you don't like that list and you say, I want to tweak that, right? That's where conformance packs comes in handy, where you can now go and make changes where you want to customize the compliance implementation for your organization. You can actually use conformance packs. And one thing that you would notice is, if you take, for example, HIPAA, about 50% of these objectives that's there in a HIPAA has nothing to do with resource types, right? So it is completely manual, other business processes that you need to implement, right? That's where these process check rules comes in handy, because these process check rules have nothing to do with a particular resource, but instead you can say, make sure that the auditor has reviewed a set of forms and signed a set of forms. So now you can create a business process. It's basically creating a business process where you create this process check rule which says auditor has signed the forms, and once the auditor has actually signed the forms, you can then call the put evaluation API saying it's compliant. And so this way it becomes a single place for you to track both your resource-based compliance as well as process-based compliance, right? So you can use conformance pack as a single entity to manage your entire compliance across your organization, right? The other part of conformance packs is in terms of reporting. So today, with conformance packs, you get an aggregated status for what is my compliance for the entire conformance pack, right? And Ajish will talk more about the launch, where we have improved the how you can actually do your posture. You can get your compliance posture in a quantitative way. But before that, I'll hand it over to Ajish, where he'll actually walk you through some of the complete the journey in terms of some of the screenshots on what the user experience is for setting up config. And then we'll go into more the actual launch that was done yesterday. So with that, let me hand it back to you, Rajesh.
Thanks, Kartik.
On.
So I'm going to start off showing you guys a little bit of the screens in config today, so you can get an idea of what the user experience looks like. So when you first run config, we set up what it's called a config recorder, and that does a discovery of on your account to create an inventory of every resource that you have on your AWS account. And from there, that inventory gets updated every time you have a configuration change. So every time you create a new resource or every time you update a resource. One of the cool things about config is that it creates this resource inventory where you can actually query all your resources and see what they are, if they're compliant or not compliant. So this is one of the really cool use cases of config to give customers visibility into what's actually in their account. Now, when we start going into the individual resources, you can see that not only is the resource captured, but the actual configuration, how is that resource actually configured? What are the settings? Where does it live? And you also see what's here called relationships. So this is really cool. So resources relate to each other, right? So when you have an EC2 instance is in a particular VPC, and config actually tracks those relationships. So you can see that for this EC2 instance, you can actually see what security group is associated with it. And that security group is also a standalone resource. So whenever there's a new user added to that security group, that gets updated, and then the relationships downstream relationships will also get updated. So that way that you have compliance not only over one resource, but the other resources that relate to it. The next thing is when you go into a resource, not only do you see the current configuration of the resource, you also have a history of the life cycle of the resource. So here you can see all the changes that occurred on a particular day. Every time there's a change, it gets timestamped and it gets recorded into config. And as Karthik mentioned, when you have rules that trigger on resource-based change on configuration changes, those rules would automatically evaluate. So in this case, you can see that between 1044 and 1045, there was a change, and that change brought the resource out of compliance. And to actually see what that was, you can click on any one of these items, and it'll actually show you what changed. So in this particular case, it looks like Elastic Network Interface was removed from the device. That's why the 2 is blank. You'll see that it originally had one, and it did not have one anymore. So someone went in and removed that ENI from that EC2 instance, and that is captured, and you have that in config. And it triggered a rule which brought that EC2 instance out of compliance. And I also want to briefly go over the conformance pack feature that Karthik ended with. So conformance packs is a really powerful feature that lets users deploy a whole set of rules at once across their accounts. And as Karthik mentioned, we have over 75 templates available for different types of conformance packs you can apply. So to apply a conformance pack, it's super simple on the AWS config console. You just click on the conformance packs item in the nav bar, and you can create your own template, or you can use one of our sample templates. And if you use one of the sample templates, you just select which one. You can customize some of the parameters, and when you click apply, it automatically applies it and starts monitoring for those rules on relevant resources. All of these templates are also available in GitHub, so you can actually go in and see the underlying parameters, underlying rules, and you even use them as a starting point. Say that you want to be PCI compliant, but you also have other requirements that you want to add to your specific PCI use case. You can edit that file. It's just a standard YAML, very similar to CloudFormation. So now I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and go into the new launch that we announced yesterday to see how that relates to solving some of these problems. So even with a automated configuration management system like Config, there's still a lot of manual effort, right? When you have an AWS account with hundreds of resources and numerous rules, it could be thousands of checks, right? A rule exists on every single one of those resources. Every time there's a change, a rule is triggered, and that's a new check. So in order to get that overall posture of like, how is your environment, how compliant are you, it's manual effort. You have to go into every one of your resources, see which rules it's not compliant with, which ones it is compliant with, evaluate that impact, and it gets even worse when you're trying to report on that status, right? When you're doing things like following up on remediation, are we making enough progress? It's been a week. How did we improve? You again have to go into every single one of those resources and every single one of those rules to see if you're compliant or not compliant. This makes it really challenging and time consuming. So a lot of times it's not even done that frequently. People just go in and they'll see, all right, I have 75 resources compliant. I don't know which ones they are. I don't know what the impact is, like how non-compliant are each one of these 75 resources. So to help with that, what we launched yesterday is a feature called Compliance Scores. Compliance scores, they apply at the conformance pack level. It allows users to actually track their overall status with a single metric. So now you can go in and see how compliant is my configuration against my requirements, and have one metric to track and give you that insight. It also lets you compare your different requirements. So as you see here, I now have a graphical view in my CPAC dashboard where I see all my different CPACs that I have applied, and I see how compliant I am against each of them. So I know which requirements I need to focus on, which requirements I need to educate my developers and admins on. The compliance score is calculated in a unique way. It's not just a measure of how many resources are compliant, or how many rules are compliant. Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me now? Okay. So it's not just a measure of resources or rules. It's actually a measure of both. So what we do is we take the number of rule resource combinations. So what that means is that when you have a rule that it's applicable to S3, for example, is my S3 bucket encrypted, we look at how many possible S3 buckets are in your account. So if you have 10 S3 buckets and you have that rule, there's 10 rule resource combinations. But if you also have EC2 instances, those are not included. But if you have different rules that apply to EC2, those create another set of rule resource combinations. So we look at the total possible rule resource combinations you have and how many of them are compliant to get at the percentage. So I'll walk through an example here. In a particular AWS account, let's say there's 3 S3 buckets and 4 EC2 instances, and you apply a conformance pack with 3 rules. 2 of the rules apply to every resource, and 1 rule applies to the S3 only. And if the status is that all S3 buckets are compliant, but 2 of the EC2 resources are not compliant with 1 of the rules, how is the score calculated? So what you see here is that the total possible combinations, that's at the 17, right? So we have 3 S3 buckets, and all 3 rules apply to all, the first 2 rules apply to all resources. So the S3 buckets are in scope for them. The last rule applies to S3, so the S3 rules are in scope for them. So we get a total of 9 for S3. On the EC2, at the bottom, you'll see the first 2 rules, which apply to all resources, are applicable to the 4 EC2 instances. So you get 4 and 4, and the last rule is not applicable, so that's 0. So you get a total of 17 rule resource combinations. Now, if you go to the top, how many are compliant? 2 are not compliant with 1 of the rules. So out of the second rule is not 2 resources are not compliant. So you get a total of 15. So the compliance score is basically 15 over 17, and it goes to 88%, a percentage of 88. Now let's say that all your S3 buckets go out of compliance too. So how does that change? So what you see now here is at the top, you have no compliant S3 buckets. So that number, that top row goes to all zero because none of your S3 buckets are compliant. Your EC2 is still the same as before, but your total number goes down to 6. The total possible is still the same, which is 17. So your score actually drops to 35%, 16 to 17, 6 out of 17, sorry, and 35%. So this is super powerful because before your status would not have changed. Before in a conformance pack, you were non-compliant before, and you're still non-compliant. You had no measure of how non-compliant you were. If I see that, looking at the rules, like I will see my S3 bucket rule has decreased by 1, but that doesn't really tell me the story, right? If I see one rule failed, I might not think that's a big deal. But if I see my score dropped by almost 50 points, that's a much bigger impact, right? That means I need to investigate what's going on. Something systematic is happening. So it gives you that measure, that more insight into what's actually going on in your environment. The other really cool feature about the compliance score is that it's emitted as a CloudWatch metric. So that allows you to trend and see how you're doing over time. So this is super helpful. It makes things like tracking remediation easy. When you see in a particular week that your compliance score is going up, you know that you're making progress. People are evaluating and fixing issues that exist in the account. You can also see the inverse, right? If your score suddenly drops within a day, it's most likely there's some sort of deployment or some sort of mass configuration event that happened to drop that score, and you know where to investigate. So that is a really powerful feature of the trending. The trending is right now is currently emitted every 12 hours. Every time the score refreshes every 12 hours, so every time the score refreshes, the metric is emitted to CloudWatch. We are working on reducing that time, hopefully, and the lower it becomes, the more valuable that insight is to users. Yep. So the question was, is the score different from the score in Security Hub? And the answer is yes. In Security Hub, the scores are based on controls. So a control in Security Hub maps to a rule. So if you have 10 rules and 9 are non-compliant, you'll have a score of 90. But that one rule could apply on 90% of your resources, and your score will still be 90%. So here we actually consider the rule resources, where Security Hub is focused on the controls. And another thing I want to highlight is that as part of the compliance score, we also have a new widget in our config dashboard, which is basically a stacked set of conformance packs with the score shown. It gives you a view right off the bat of all your different conformance packs and their compliance score. It's sorted lowest score to highest score, so the items that need more attention is at the top. So now some of the use cases for compliance score. So as I said earlier, it gives you that one glance view into how you're doing. You don't have to go into the details, see how many resources are non-compliant, how many rules each resource is not compliant with. You look at a number, and it's a nuanced metric that actually means something. The other thing is, with the trending, you can identify issues that you previously couldn't see before. If you have temporary workloads, for example, workloads that only run at night, and you're checking your conformance packs daily or during working hours, you'll see them. You could see the status as compliant, though at night it would be non-compliant, right? But now it's a trending. We're capturing that history so that in the dashboard itself, you'll see the drops and the peaks and valleys. So you'll see that something's happening at night, and you can investigate what's going on. You can track. With the CloudWatch integration, you can also set alarms for remediation SLAs, right? If you say that a score drops by over 10% in the course of, let's say, 3 days, that could be an alarm, like the SLA to fix that has not been met. So that is another powerful feature with the CloudWatch integration. And the last benefit is that you have that consistent metric now to compare all your different requirements and even your different accounts, right? When you apply a conformance pack across all your different accounts, now you can see, hey, this account is 85%, this account is 90%. You can see which teams need the most assistance in figuring out what your compliance requirements are. So compliance packs is available today in all the US regions. It'll be deployed on all other commercial regions by the end of the week. There's no extra charges for using compliance scores and no action that customers need to take. It's turned on right now by default in the US regions. It'll be turned on in every other region later this week. And as soon as you go into the config console, you'll see that score right there. There's also APIs that are available. So there's a new API that's called list scores, list compliance scores, and that can be called systematically so that you can get a complete listing of all your conformance packs and their scores if you need to use it for reporting or any other programmatic use. So yeah. Yeah. So the question was, how, if we could, is it possible to integrate this score into Security Hub? So right now, you can integrate conformance packs into Security Hub, where if there's items that are non-compliant, it'll show up as findings in conformance in Security Hub, but the score does not get reported to Security Hub. So that is a good item for us, and we'll take it as a consideration. Thank you. So that's it for us. That's compliance score in a nutshell.